preparation for this service, I reviewed Remembrance Day services from the past several years. I noticed the listing of the names that you heard read earlier from some of Fourth Universalist storied ministers. You'll find plaques up here with their names honoring them. I did some searching on Wikipedia and looked at some of their writings that are available online. I read Phyllis Stock Morton's excellent history of Fourth Universalist writing that was written in, I think, 1988. And I looked over Jim Saslow's wonderful presentation on PowerPoint of the history of the congregation. And as I read, I began to recognize some threads, some ways these ministers have left lasting impressions on this congregation's identity. During the Fourth Universalist Discovery Workshop, November 9th, gentle reminder, you are strongly encouraged to attend. Participants will be asked to reflect on their personal experiences of participation here as it relates to the congregation's more recent history. I thought it would be helpful this morning to contextualize our own personal memories in the larger sweep of the history of this congregation's identity that maybe most of you may not be aware of. The minister who had probably the biggest influence on the early identity of Fourth Universalist, who I deeply appreciate even though our theologies are very different, was Edwin Hubble Chapin. Chapin was called to serve this congregation in 1848, just 10 years after the beginning in 1848. Unlike many Protestant ministers at the time, he didn't preach a polemical message of we're right and everyone else is wrong. Chapin preferred to discuss people's social concerns and relate them to what a universalist approach to Christianity could offer. The social issues that he spoke out against were ones like capital punishment. He spoke for kindness to animals and the sacredness of all human life. Unusual for his time, he spoke out against the forces of poverty that drove women into prostitution because they couldn't get a living wage to support themselves, or if they had families and they were single parents, not enough to do that either. He inspired the first Universalist mission to help poor mothers with their newborn babies, weighing them and then offering nutritional counsel. The Chapin Home for the Aged and Infirm was created during his ministry and run by the women of the church. Chapin strongly opposed slavery as a violation of Universalist principles and values, but unfortunately was a little more ambivalent in the support of abolition. That may have been because prominent members of this congregation were probably profiting on the production process driven by Southern slaves. Or it might have been his Universalist approach to Christianity that didn't like separating people into conflicting sides. He saw the Universalist approach to Christianity in the way that we might think of as ecumenicism today. Universalism for Chapin was the way to unite all the different sects of Christianity under one roof. The denomination he and other Universalist ministers had the most difficult time with for this universal Christianity idea was Unitarianism. Many Universalists were Trinitarians in their theology because For them, Jesus had a special role in the salvation process. His death and resurrection was necessary to reconcile God with humanity and trigger the universal salvation that they preached. It was universal atonement that was accomplished through the crucifixion of Jesus. Humanity was in the process of realizing what had been done for us and accepting the consequences. These consequences were the coming end of all war, the end of human strife, and world peace. Chapin died in 1880 at the age of 66. Charles Eaton, mentioned earlier, took the reins of leadership. I imagine following a 32-year, extremely popular ministry must have been very challenging. But from Phyllis's history, it appears that Eaton rose to that challenge. He attracted the Whitfield family and married their daughter Louisa to Andrew Carnegie. And Louisa donated the organ that you see behind us. Striving to fill Chapin's shoes was not without stress, however, as the poor fellow died at the age of 50. Chapin's church was built and dedicated just after the Civil War on 45th Street and 5th Avenue. And that area was turning into a commercial hub at the time, no longer a residential neighborhood. The pressure to sell that very valuable real estate and move uptown was strong. Moving to 76th Street turned out to be a wise choice, as the wealthy were moving uptown too and building luxury apartment houses and beautiful brownstones. The dedication of this Universalist cathedral in 1898 felt like the capstone of 19th century Universalism. Frank Hall inherited the very successful congregation both Chapin and Eaton had built. He continued the social concern of Chapin and Eaton, but more focused on the social gospel movement that was growing in Protestantism. This movement often identified with Walter Rauschenbusch from Chicago or from Rochester. He studied the poverty here in Hell's Kitchen and called for social reform. Theologically, that call was to follow a Jesus who responded to the needs of the dispossessed. The idea was Jesus came to reform the world and to restore paradise on earth for everyone. If we are to follow Jesus, we should do the same. Fourth Universalist was already active in social service to poor women and educating young people, many of whom were not Universalists. Hall encouraged the purchase of a 100-acre fresh air farm, I think in New Jersey, for urban children to be restored in a natural setting in the summer to get them out of town. As World War I approached, Hall, along with community church minister John Haynes Holmes, was a staunch pacifist. Unfortunately, he did back down from this when the U.S. entered the war and then left to teach at Tufts University after the war in 1919. He did come back then a few years later in 1929 to serve for another 9 years. 1929, you might remember, was not a happy time for New York City, and the many lost fortunes, particularly some of the people in this congregation. It was unfortunately the beginning of a fairly long, slow decline for this congregation. The neighborhood around us and in the Upper West Side began to decline. Two, especially during the post-World War II years, as the congregants were fleeing the city to the suburbs and creating congregations there. Universalism was in significant decline in the 20th century around the country. I think World War I ended the optimistic view of human progress, onward and upward forever, prevalent in the Victorian era that harmonized with universalism. Their Christian elitism that eventually drove colonialism in different parts of the world seemed false to them given the barbarism that they experienced on the battlefields of Europe. The humanism of Charles Francis Potter seemed to be the wave of the future, a future that this congregation strongly rejected in the 1920s during his ministry. Fourth Universalists continued to lose members in the 1950s and 60s. They voted against merger with the atheist Unitarians in 1960, even giving the deed to this building to the Universalist Convention of New York to prevent the Unitarians from ever getting their hands on this property if they had to close. A decision that they later regretted and tried to reverse. The major turning point in the life of this congregation was the call of Richard Kellaway in 1968. He brought an openness to new ideas, especially the energy present in the counterculture movement. His sermons explored world religions, humanism, and de-emphasized Christianity. The big trend he rode was the attraction of the baby boom generation to big cities like New York. This generation created a large pool of young singles living and working in Manhattan. They were attracted to the activities that Kellaway put together in the congregation that catered to singles. Fourth U offered a place where liberated men and women could come together to meet each other and form non-traditional relationships, especially ones free from the sexual restrictions outside of marriage and including non-heterosexual relationships. Here are some of the novel activities that Kellaway brought that Phyllis in her history lists. There were encounter groups and sensitivity groups, a social responsibility workshop, and other discussion groups. The Rosebud Coffee House brought singles together just to chat or for amateur performances. Poetry in the Park, multimedia light shows, Missa Luba love celebrations, Family of Man Sunday, and they had an Easter jazz spectacular. So far, I've mostly just mentioned male ministers. You heard earlier Helene Ulrich's name. I did a little sleuthing about her to see what I could find out about her. She was ordained here in 1922 during the tenure of Joseph Fort Newton to support his ministry and one of the mission ministries of the congregation. The New York Herald reported that she was the first woman appointed minister within this congregation and in Manhattan as a whole. They also pointed out that she wept during the service. It seemed a little weird. There are sparse details, unfortunately, about her online. I didn't have a chance to get into the archives, but I found that she retired to Fort Myers and helped to organize the Unitarian Universalist Church there, preaching their first sermon. We get a sense of who she was from their history. In the early 1960s, she was an outstanding advocate for human rights and fought for social programs. She tangled and overcame the Fort Myers Symphony Board's ruling that black people could not attend or buy tickets to their concerts. She also worked with Dunbar High School's administrator and other black leaders that went a long way to break down segregation and smooth local integration. She died in Fort Myers in September 1965, having served for many years as a lay leader and as a community spokesperson. I hope you can join with me in pride that I feel for the ministerial leadership Fourth Universalist has had. We inherit a universalist approach to religion and humanity that can animate our new articulation of liberatory love at the center of Unitarian Universalism. There are differences, of course, to be sure. We no longer embrace an exclusive understanding of Jesus as the one unique world Savior. Yet, whether you believe in God, Jesus, or are a scientific materialist atheist, the values we cherish find a grounding in our biblical heritage, especially the social gospel. I hope you've recognized maybe a thread or two of who we are today in this history. There is so much more in our history to learn about and appreciate. New York City has grown up with influences from our Unitarian and Universalist ministers here and with All Souls, Community Church, Brooklyn UU. Our identity today is shaped by our current members, of course, but our history is also part of this congregation's DNA. And it can grow and evolve as it has. Fourth Universalist Society in the city of New York needs the members present today and the clarity about our heritage, mission, and vision to attract the ministerial leadership you seek that will shape the future of this congregation, a future we cannot yet know. Your participation on November 9th will be part of that process.